Our first speaker today, and I'm proud of these speakers because they're willing to take a stand. Because I'll be honest, this year, it's the third year I've done this, getting speakers. I had a lot of people that would normally come out, said they're not going to do it because of the political environment and what happened in Charlottesville. And I said, you know, we've got to stand. We have to stand. If we all hide, we're going to lose everything. I'm also thankful for the United Daughters of the Confederacy that will be here. If you're here already, I'm sorry if I missed you, but I'm thankful for them because they started it all. They're the ones that put up the monuments. They're the ones that we need to be celebrating and getting behind and help them so we secure these monuments for our future. But as far as our speakers, our first introduction is Travis Toombs. He's going to be speaking on Confederate monuments. I talked to him just briefly. He is with the A.P. Hill. General A.P. Hill. You know, he was killed right there at Petersburg, right at the end of the war. So I want to bring him right now, and you're welcome to speak. You got 45 minutes, but if you go longer, hey, we're not going to.
Don't tell me that.
Get that.
Don't tell me that.
All right.
All right. Before I get going good, I think I got most everybody, but does anybody in here not have one of these? I still got a few left. Anybody not have one? All right. I'm gonna get y'all right quick.
I have one.
One more.
Yes, sir. Got one more. Anybody need it? All right. All right, like he said, I am Travis Toombs, and I'm going to move this back. If you've ever heard me speak, you'll realize real quick I probably won't need it. I'm from Petersburg, Virginia, and I'm what I'm going to consider the opening act of today, because probably very few people came here to see me. You came here to see the much more qualified speakers behind me, the ones that will probably do a whole lot better job than I am. But I hope that you'll leave wowed, at least, by the quality of the opening act. But I'll assure you, especially that man sitting right there, I won't hold a candle to him, and I ain't even going to try. But I am here today to talk about Confederate monuments. And if you've had time to read the paper that I gave everybody, I'm going to be answering some questions. Not exactly your normal kind of speech, but I think that by answering these questions in this speech, it will help some people to formulate answers when they are asked questions similar to this. If anybody is connected with me on Facebook, I've kind of given very brief answers to these questions, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. But if you want to take notes, or if you want to video a certain answer to a certain question, or if you want to video the whole thing, you're more than welcome to. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get going with the first question. Question number 1. Do Confederate monuments advocate white supremacy? The answer is no, they do not. Confederate monuments don't advocate anything based off of the definition of the word advocate. To advocate for something means to publicly recommend or support something. A much more appropriate term would be that Confederate monuments commemorate something. To commemorate something means to recall and show respect for something. So what do Confederate monuments commemorate then? Monuments often say exactly what they commemorate right on the monument. That is one of the major purposes of a monument in the first place. One of the definitions of the word monument is a statue, building, or other structure erected to commemorate a famous or notable person or event. So let's take the Robert E. Lee Monument on Monument Avenue, for example. Let's compare the dedication speech of that monument to what the monument actually says on it. Here's the ending of the dedication speech. Quote, "Let this monument, then, teach to generations yet unborn these lessons of Robert E. Lee's life. Let it stand, not as a record of civil strife, but as a perpetual protest against whatever is low and sordid in our private and public objects. Let it stand as a memorial of personal honor that never brooked a stain, of knightly valor without thought of self, of far-reaching military genius unsoiled by ambition, of heroic constancy from which no cloud of misfortune could ever hide the path of duty. Let it stand for reproof and censure if our people shall ever sink below the standards of their fathers. Let it stand for patriotic hope and cheer if a day of national gloom and disaster shall ever dawn upon our country. Let it stand as the embodiment of a brave and virtuous people's ideal leader. Let it stand as a great public act of thanksgiving and praise for that it pleased Almighty God to bestow upon these southern states a man so formed to reflect his attributes of power, majesty, and goodness. That was the orator of the day for the dedication speech of the Robert E. Lee Monument on Monument Avenue. That was Colonel Archer Anderson, and that is how it was printed in the Times newspaper, March 30th, 1890. Now, the dedication speech, which that was not all of it, spoke a great deal about Robert E. Lee. So what does the monument say on it? Lee. The only word on the monument is Lee. With these two pieces of information, there should be no question as to what this monument's purpose is: to commemorate Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Now, back to the advocating for white supremacy thing that it said in the question. We have ruled out they don't advocate anything, but do they commemorate white supremacy? If someone can show me one single Confederate monument that says anything about the supremacy of the white race, then maybe I would say that is possible. But until then, the answer to the question is a resounding no. Remember, monuments will almost always have written on them about what they commemorate. There are thousands of Confederate monuments, and I have never seen one Confederate monument say anything about the supremacy of the white race, nor do I expect to see one saying that anytime soon. These monuments are just what they say they are. Monuments to remember people who defended their homes and firesides against an invading Yankee army. Phrases like, quote, in lasting memory of every Confederate soldier from, insert whatever county you're from here, who faithfully served the South, end quote. Or another one, quote, in memory of the 398 Virginia soldiers lying in this cemetery who fell in defense of constitutional liberty and the sovereignty of their state, end quote. Or how about this monument that is in the cemetery right up the street from here that simply says, erected to the memory of our Southern soldiers. The only thing Confederate monuments advocate is commemorating those who fought and died for the Commonwealth of Virginia and or the Confederacy. That is it. Question 2. Confederate monuments remind some people of the horrors of slavery and therefore should be removed from public eye. Do you agree? Answer: no, I do not. I often wonder to myself why these Confederate monuments remind people of slavery. How could a monument that doesn't say anything about slavery or have a slave on it remind people of slavery? Again, let's take the Lee Monument for example. It only has one word on it, which is Lee. It has General Lee sitting on Traveler, and he is in full Confederate uniform. This monument could possibly remind people of Robert E. Lee, because he is the general depicted on the monument. It could remind people of Traveler, because he is the horse depicted on the monument. It could remind people of the War of Northern Aggression, because there is a Confederate general on it. But how can it remind people of slavery? The only reason they remind people of the horrors of slavery is because someone told them that they should be reminded of the horrors of slavery. Someone told them that the man on that monument fought for slavery, and because of that they hate these monuments. Well, that man did not fight for slavery, but I'll get more into that in a later question. Without the false added knowledge that the Confederate soldiers fought for slavery, there would be no way for these monuments to remind anyone of the horrors of slavery. Confederate monuments are almost always to war veterans and or government officials that fought for their homes and families. Most of these monuments do not even mention slavery, slaves, or enslavement, but there are some that do. But it is worthy of noting that those that do mention slaves are only mentioning them as a way to thank the former slaves for their service and loyalty to the Confederacy. That's right, the only time you see a Confederate monument bringing up slavery is when that monument is a way to thank the former slaves for being loyal to the South. Now, for those who already see these Confederate monuments as reminders of slavery, if the argument that Confederate monuments should be removed because they remind people of slavery is continually used, then why is there no outcry to remove monuments or memorials to the sites of former slave auction blocks, such as the one in Fredericksburg, Virginia? Why is there no outcry to tear down the former slave quarters at Monticello? Why is there no demand for the removal of the Richmond Slave Trails walking tour? The purpose of these items are to remind people of slavery. Why is it that someone can cry for the removal of a Confederate monument because it reminds them of slavery, while also advocating for the addition of slave auction blocks? We should leave all of them just as they are. The irony is so thick it can be cut with a knife. But the point is, those who can look at the General Lee monument and be reminded of slavery and not reminded of General Lee are the only seeing what they were told to see.
That's right.
That is it.
Amen.
Question number 3. A majority of Confederate monuments were put up during Jim Crow, which is the early 1900s, and Civil Rights 1960s periods. Do they represent the racial disdain during that time period? Answer: no, they do not. I'm not going to comment on the racial disdain from the 1900s and 1960s because I'm here to talk about Confederate monuments, not the causes of Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Act. So, with that out of the way, the first Confederate monument erected, at least that I am aware of, is the Confederate Pyramid in Hollywood Cemetery, Richmond, Virginia. Erected in 1869, while Virginia was still occupied territory, this monument has an inscription on it that a great many Confederate monuments, no matter when they were erected, have on it. It says, "To the Confederate Dead." After the war was over, the South was in ruins. Thanks to the Yankee Army's methods of destruction and devastation, especially Sherman and Sheridan, it took many years for the citizens of the South to recuperate. It should be fairly easy to understand that when your army has been starving to death and eating their own boots for survival during the war, that after the war is over, it will take some time to recuperate and rebuild. However, once the South did bounce back on their feet, they immediately began to remember their Confederate dead. And what better time to remember, honor, and commemorate your family members who fought and died defending their homes and families than on the anniversaries of when they fought, such as the 50th anniversary from 1911 to 1915, or the 100th anniversary from 1961 to 1965. It is very common to commemorate something on an anniversary, such as when the National 9/11 Memorial opened, September 11th, 2011, 10 years to the day after the attacks. Or how about the National Constitution Monument, which was dedicated September 17th, 1987, exactly 200 years to the day after the signing of the Constitution. And this year, 2018, there will be a dedication of the National World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C. during the 100-year anniversary of the war. In fact, according to Ken Clark, who is the president of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago, there is a very good reason why it has taken this long to get a National World War I memorial built. Because 25 years after World War I, it was 1943, and America was occupied with World War II. 50 years after World War I, it was 1967, and America was occupied with Vietnam. America was wrapped up in such high-profile wars that 2 major anniversaries that we didn't have time to reflect on the 2 years that we were involved in World War I. Mr. Clark also mentioned that there are thousands of World War I monuments around this nation that have been erected in localities. His reason for why is that back then, remembering war dead was a very local and personal thing. This is the same reason why almost every county in Virginia has erected monuments to the Confederate dead at local courthouses or town squares. Even though you might hear somewhere else that these local monuments were erected to promote racial superiority. The truth is that back then, everything was kept local, so they built local monuments. It has nothing to do with race. But the point is, monuments tend to go up on major events, major anniversaries of events. A large number of Confederate monuments were erected during the years of 1911 and 1915 and 1961 through 1965 because they correspond with major anniversaries. It has nothing to do with the Jim Crow era or the Civil Rights Movement. Confederate monuments stand for one thing: our Confederate dead. Question number 4. Some of these Confederate monuments depict people who owned slaves. Why should we leave monuments erected to slave owners? Answer: because no person save Jesus Christ is perfect, especially when that someone lived in one time period but is judged based off of the morals and standards of another. Did these people own slaves? Yes. Did most of the population wealthy enough to purchase slaves back then own slaves? Yes. Slavery is evil, and we all know that now. But in the 18th and 19th century, slavery was legal under the United States Constitution and was a widespread practice in all 13 colonies. This reasoning might be the most dangerous way of thinking I have ever seen. Those that want this monument removed for this reason are people who don't understand the precedent they are setting. Let's think for a second. What is considered acceptable in society 10 years ago that is no longer okay today? Things like opposition to gay marriage was considered acceptable 10 years ago, but today, among a growing number of Americans who also wish to see Confederate monuments taken down, it is not okay to oppose gay marriage. Will these same people who want to tear down all memorials of those who adamantly opposed gay marriage 10 years ago? The same principle for those who refuse to call a man a woman. It would be considered normal 10 years ago that if a man dressed up as a woman, you would still call that person a man. If you were to do that now, you would have rocks thrown at you by some people and called a bigot. These are both examples of people who lived in a different time but are being judged by modern standards. If we allow this way of thinking to continue, then what will become of us in 25 years? I can't imagine what things we do right now that we consider normal and okay, that will be considered bigoted, racist, or hateful 25 years from now. If this precedent sets, then no historical figure is safe. That means the great people from today that will be considered bigoted, racist, and evil 25 years from now for something that is normal right now. If we purge ourselves from all persons in history who owned slaves or who in one way, shape, or form participated in slavery, we will be left with no history at all. Monuments should remind us of the good that can be found in all these historical figures. Even if you're not a fan of someone, there's always some good that can be found in them. We can all agree that Adolf Hitler was one of the worst, most evil and twisted people in the modern world. However, he did at least one thing that some still consider good. Hitler was a big fan of the idea of a cheap car so that his little Nazis could have access to cars. For those who don't know, that car company is still around today. It's called Volkswagen. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm in no way comparing our Confederate heroes to Hitler, nor am I suggesting that Hitler have any statues. What I'm pointing out is that everyone has at least something good they can be remembered for. That's right. Let us remember, emulate, and pass down the good things about our history, but never forget the bad. That's right. We don't have to continue doing the bad things, but we must remember them. Think of our country as a tree. Think of our country's history as the roots of this tree. And think of these monuments as the roots that stick up above the surface to remind us that there are roots below. Without these subtle reminders of our root system, it becomes much easier to forget that the roots are there over time. What happens if you cut a tree away from its roots? The tree falls over. Removing monuments to slaveholders will disconnect us completely from our history, leaving our country as a tree without any roots that will fall with the next big gust of wind. Amen. Question number 5. The South lost the War of Northern Aggression, so why should they have monuments? Answer. After the war was over, the North wanted the South to come back into the Union of States and willingly remain a part of that Union. After all, that is truly what the North was fighting for. That wish became a reality, and once again, after some time to cool down, the states of America were reunited. As a way to heal the wounds of war and a way to come together in mind and spirit, monuments were erected to honor and remember the soldiers whom the states asked to go fight on their behalf. Soon after the war was over, many soldiers from both sides began to form a brotherhood with soldiers that fought with them and against them. This is why there were former soldiers from the North present at many Confederate monument dedications, and there were former soldiers from the South present at Yankee monument dedications. In fact, the Confederate veterans of the A.P. Hill Camp, number 6 of Petersburg, Virginia, took a train all the way up to Massachusetts to march in the 4th of July parade there. When the Virginia Monument in Gettysburg was dedicated in 1917, the governor of Massachusetts set a wreath to the dedication event. There is also a picture floating around of Massachusetts troops standing in front of that newly dedicated Confederate monument. When former Union General and former U.S. President Ulysses Grant died in 1885, there were Confederate veterans that took part in the funeral procession to honor General Grant. The monument / tombstone of Confederate Major General George Pickett in Hollywood Cemetery was dedicated on October 5th, 1888. In the crowd that day were many old soldiers from Pennsylvania regiments. Please listen very carefully to this little excerpt from Major R. Taylor Scott's address at the unveiling of this monument. Quote, "Bless too, O Lord, these men from Pennsylvania who have come here to participate with us in these services, whom we once met as foes but now esteem as friends. May our reunions be genuine, and may like leaven permeate the whole land. Bless Pennsylvania and Virginia, and all the states of our Union." End quote. These men understood that a union of states remembers and accepts the history of all of the states in that union, not just one section of the states. There was no cry from the old Yankee soldiers for the Confederate monuments to come down. Rather, they were there at the dedications. If the men who were dodging the bullets fired by the men whom these monuments are dedicated to are in favor of these monuments, then that should be the end of the discussion. But what people in modern times don't understand is that when you have a union of states in which one group of states, for example the South, has their history subjugated, suppressed, and superseded by the remainder of the states, it suggests that the rest of the country is attempting to rule over the South, even though they were supposed to be united and equal once again. As long as monuments from both sides remain in place, this will likely remain one nation. But if the South has their history erased, eliminated, and eradicated, it will lead to the Southerners feeling like a conquered people once more, and this voluntary union of states might separate once again. Question 6. Those that joined the Confederacy were traitors to their country and therefore should not have monuments erected to them. Do you agree? Answer. No, I do not. Confederate soldiers were not traitors to their country. Their country's government were traitors to them.
Amen.
There are many reasons why the southern states left the Union, and the common factor of all those reasons were concerns of the northern states disobeying and disregarding the Constitution of the United States of America. This is why when the Confederate government began to write their Constitution, they used the Constitution of the United States of America as a model, only making a few changes to ensure the sovereignty of the states. The United States government had violated the United States Constitution in the following ways prior to the war. Article 1, Section 8, when they unfairly taxed the South at nearly 50% of the cost of the imported product. Article 1, Section 9, when they showed preference to northern shipping manufacturers by allowing them to avoid paying taxes. Article 4, Section 2, when the northern states refused to deliver fugitive slaves back to their owners. Article 4, Section 4, when the United States government invaded Maryland en route to Virginia in April of 1861. And Amendment number 10, when the United States government began to artificially prop up northern manufacturing by redirecting tax money from the South to the North. The Constitution of 1787 is a formal agreement between all of the participating states. This agreement ensures that all the states involved, as well as the central government created by this Constitution, will adhere to the rules and limitations set forth in this agreement. If these rules and limitations are broken, then the states have the right to dissolve their agreement and leave the Union of States. In any other case, if one party does not hold up to their end of a formal agreement, then the other party has the right to dissolve their agreement. The legal precedent for secession is the Declaration of Independence, 1776, when the 13 colonies seceded from Great Britain. Secession of individual states is legal according to the 9th Amendment of the United States Constitution as one of the enumerated powers protected under that amendment. The government officials and leaders of the Confederate States of America were not traitors to their country. Their country had turned against them and against the Constitution, leaving them with no other option but secession. Amen. Now, in regards to the regular soldiers enlisted in the Confederate military, they were simply defending their homes and families from an invading army marching onto their lands. These soldiers were volunteer at first. However, after 1862, they were drafted into service, leaving the soldiers with no choice in the matter. If a man is given no choice in the matter, he cannot be held responsible for what he does. Regardless of if you believe the truth about why the southern states left the Union or if you believe the lies about slavery, you cannot fault the Confederate soldier because in most cases he had no choice but to fight. Amen. Question number 7. The Confederacy fought for slavery, so why should we leave monuments erected of those that fought for slavery? Answer. The reasons for which the South left the Union of States and the reason for which they fought during the War of Northern Aggression are completely different. Amen. The South left the Union of States only after repeated violations by the North of the agreed-upon Constitution of 1787. This was covered while I was answering the last question. The South did not leave the Union over slavery because if they had, there would have never been a war. Prior to the beginning of hostilities, there was the Crittenden Compromise, which was introduced by John Crittenden of Kentucky. This compromise offered 6 constitutional amendments that would effectively reaffirm the Missouri Compromise, let states choose to allow slavery or not, reaffirm the constitutionality of slavery, and force the fugitive slave law to be enforced. The South rejected this compromise. The next attempt at compromise was when the Commonwealth of Virginia called a peace conference to entice the radical North and the already seceded South to come to a compromise, thus saving the Union. This peace conference resolved to add an amendment to the Constitution similar to the one Crittenden offered, except with different wording, which effectively legalized slavery forever. The South rejected this compromise. The last attempt at compromise was when Thomas Corwin of Ohio proposed a new amendment to the Constitution. This amendment was passed by both the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate and then signed by lame duck President James Buchanan. It stated that, and I quote, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which shall authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state," end quote. So the purpose of this proposed 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, had it been made law, would have made slavery forever legal in all states where it was currently legal and all states that chose for slavery to exist. Meaning if slavery was why the South seceded, then this should have brought them back into the Union. But it didn't, because the South was not truly leaving the Union over slavery. If you have a major disagreement with someone and there is an impending fight about to happen, but then that person decides to give you what you want in return for no fighting, would you take that deal? Of course you would. Everyone would. If the South was leaving the Union over worries of slavery being abolished, then why not come back into the Union when the North offered these amendments? If someone is handing you what you want on a silver platter, why would you fight them? It's because the South wasn't seceding over slavery, so these amendments would have done no good whatsoever. The North in 1860 just did not understand why the South was leaving, and they still don't understand today. Amen. This proposed 13th Amendment was never made law due to it not being ratified by the states, because the states would be busy fighting a war against the Confederate States of America. So, it has been established that the South did not leave the Union over slavery, but did they fight over slavery? No, they did not. There is only one reason the South fought during that war. The presence of the Yankee Army within the borders of the Confederate States of America is the only reason a war took place. Had the United States of America not invaded the Confederate States of America, there would have been no war. In fact, ambassadors sent by the Confederate government attempted to speak with President Lincoln in March of 1861, which is prior to the war, but President Lincoln did not receive the ambassadors. United States Secretary of State William Seward declined to meet with them as well. Confederate States of America wanted there to be peace between them and the United States of America. However, that feeling was not mutual. So the point here is that if we remove Confederate monuments, we are effectively removing monuments to those who wanted to abide by the Constitution and remain peaceful with other countries. Maybe we should be looking to these monuments for answers instead of social media or the news channels. Question number 8. These monuments are magnets for white supremacists, neo-Nazis, the KKK, and all other white racist organizations, and if we leave them up, they will continue to create havoc in our country. Do you agree? Answer: yes. I agree that if we leave Confederate monuments standing, then the white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the KKK will continue to create havoc in our country. However, if we take them down, they will create even more havoc in our country. Racism will not be extinguished by removing any monument of anything anywhere. Amen. Racism is an alternative and misguided way of thinking, fueled by the media, the government, and those who hate the South. The racists who celebrate Confederate monuments because they believe that these monuments represent the supremacy of the white race are just as wrong as those who hate the monuments for the same reason. Amen. These monuments are memorials to those who served in the Confederate military and or the Confederate government. The Confederate military and the Confederate government employed the use of men and women of all races, religions, ages, and ancestries. Let's take Richard Poplar, for example. That is Private Richard Poplar. He was a black man from Petersburg who volunteered to serve in the 13th Virginia Cavalry. He was listed as a private, which means he likely carried a musket. And he was captured on the retreat back from Gettysburg. He was taken to Point Lookout, where he spent over a year there as a prisoner. It is said that when the Yankees asked him to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, he refused and responded that he was, quote, a Jeff Davis man. When he died after the war, this brave black Confederate soldier's casket was draped with the Confederate flag. His coffin was carried by Confederate soldiers. His funeral was attended by people of all races, and he is buried with full Confederate honors in Blandford Cemetery in my home of Petersburg, Virginia. Now, this is just one story of one particular black Confederate. There are thousands more who all have ties to the Confederacy, and when you erect a monument, especially a monument to the common soldier of the South, that monument represents the black Confederate soldiers as well, not just the white ones. These racists that have disgraced my ancestors' good name with their misguided way of thinking should be aware of that when they rally to these monuments. Southern history, as well as Confederate history, is not singular to one race. I'll say that again. Southern history, as well as Confederate history, is not singular to one race, which is something the racist monument supporters and the ignorant monument haters can't seem to get through their heads. If you take these monuments down, the racism in these people's hearts and minds will still be there, and they will find different things to rally around. No matter if these monuments stay standing or if they are torn down, the scourge of racism will not be cured either way. Question number 9. These monuments create uneasy feelings for some who see them, and for that reason alone, they should be removed from public eye. Do you agree? Answer. No, I do not agree. I am well aware that when some people see Confederate monuments, they might feel any number of uneasy feelings. I'm not going to try and pretend to know what those feelings are, or what it's like to have them. I have not walked a mile in their shoes, just as they have not walked a mile in mine. I understand that their uneasy feelings are very powerful in nature, and I would not wish those kinds of feelings to be felt by anyone. However, as real as those feelings are, they only feel that way because they were told an incorrect history regarding these monuments and that time period. If someone were to look at these monuments without any prior knowledge, these monuments would not be offensive at all. As I talked about in question number 1, what is inscribed on these monuments is not offensive in the least. The uneasy feelings begin when that person is told why they should feel uneasy about these monuments. For example, if someone were to convince a large group of people over many, many years that toasters are racist and offensive and should be removed, it would not necessarily be the large group's fault for wishing that toasters be removed. It is what they were taught to feel about the toaster. It is no different than those who are taught their whole lives that these monuments represent white supremacy and should be removed because of it. But just because they are offended by these things does not necessarily mean those things should be removed from sight. Amen. Confederate monuments don't represent white supremacy in any way, even though a hateful group of people thoroughly believe they do. Removing these monuments is just like putting a sticker over your check engine light in your car. The sticker might cover the light up, but unless you fix the problem with your engine, that light will still be on. Maybe instead of removal, how about those who have uneasy feelings about these monuments talk to those who understand that these monuments don't stand for white supremacy, and see if we can cure the root cause of those uneasy feelings. Education is the key. Amen. And if these people with uneasy feelings had been educated correctly from the get-go, then there would have been no uneasy feelings to begin with. This is why teaching our children the true history of the South is the only way to cure this problem forever. Question number 10. The Germans do not have any monuments to Hitler or the Nazi soldiers. Why does the South have monuments to Jefferson Davis and the Confederate soldiers? Answer. The Nazi political party in Germany was a totalitarian, fascist, racist government organization whose leader, Adolf Hitler, was bent on world domination. He believed his race of people was superior to all others and that the Jews should be exterminated. He had them thrown into concentration camps where they were nearly worked to death, or they were thrown into the gas chambers to die. The Nazi Party was committing genocide, killing innocent civilians, and making war with any country it thought it could conquer. In contrast, the Confederate Army was filled with warriors of all races who were not seeking to conquer anything and did not want war with any other country. No person with any knowledge of history should even begin to compare the Confederate States of America or the soldiers that fought for it with the Nazi Party of Germany in 1930s and the 1940s. Amen. Those who compare Nazi Germany to the Confederate States of America are proving to the world their historical ignorance. Those who compare Nazi Germany to the Confederate States of America are almost always making the comparison for shock value in an effort to garner an emotional reaction. But more importantly, those who compare Nazi Germany to the Confederate States of America are insulting not only 70 million Americans with Confederate ancestors, but also all of the descendants and still living Jewish people who were brutally slaughtered during the Holocaust. To make such an inaccurate comparison only brings about two results. It severely diminishes the suffering, evil, and torture that the Jewish people went through under the Nazi occupation, and it perpetuates lies and falsehoods regarding Southern history while increasing the likelihood of repetition. Think about, for a second, the Congressional Medal of Honor and how selective they are about handing out that special medal. You really have to do something special, honorable, and downright heroic to get that medal. And because the general public is aware of how difficult it is to get that medal, when someone tells you they earned one of those medals, you take a step back. You say, wow, this person must really be a true American hero. You respond that way because the meaning of the medal is very specific, and the medal is not just handed out to any soldier. If the rules were suddenly changed and every soldier got that medal, then the medal would become effectively meaningless, and this honor that was bestowed upon those who have received it in the past would be diminished. Their actions would not be diminished, but the honor they were bestowed would be. Their medals could become less meaningful. Now let's take the term Nazi. It used to be that when someone was compared to a Nazi, that meant that these people were the worst of the worst. As we all know, the Nazis were the worst of the worst. But every time you call a Confederate soldier or the proud descendant of one a Nazi, you are diminishing the use of the word. If all of a sudden everyone you disagree with is a Nazi, then the severity of the term is diminished and the term becomes more normalized. And by doing that, you are severely dishonoring the memory of those Jews who perished during the Holocaust. There are very few incidents in world history that are more evil, atrocious, and despicable than what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust, and that is a fact. But considering the Yankee Army's unnecessary slaughter of innocent women and children and Abraham Lincoln's inextinguishable desire to make war with the South, I would dare say that the United States of America, what they did during the War of Northern Aggression, is much more comparable to Hitler and Nazi Germany than anything the Confederate States of America supposedly did.
Amen.
Sherman's march is a lot easier to compare to the Nazi Army's marches than is the Confederate Army.
That's right.
But you don't see me running around comparing Yankee soldiers and their descendants to Nazis.
Amen.
This country is becoming more and more divided by the day. And until comparisons between a Confederate soldier and a Nazi soldier stop, the split will only continue to grow. It is very difficult for me to play nice with someone who compares me and my ancestors to Nazis. And I imagine I'm not the only one that feels that way.
Amen.
Question 11. Why should Confederate monuments remain standing? Answer. Because every time we see a Confederate monument, we get a chance to remind ourselves, and hopefully someone else, what the true cause of the South was. Because every time we see a Confederate monument, we get a chance to reawaken the spirit of the Southern soldier, buried deep within each and every descendant. And every time we see a Confederate monument, we get a chance to reignite the fires of liberty that burn in the hearts of all of those who know the truth.
Amen.
People, listen to this quote from Confederate Major General Patrick Cleburne from a letter he wrote in January of 1864. Quote, "It means that the history of this heroic struggle will be written by the enemy, that our youth will be trained by Northern school teachers. We'll learn from Northern books their version of the war. We'll be impressed by all the influences of history and education to regard our gallant dead as traitors, our maimed veterans as fit objects for derision." End quote. This Confederate general must have used a crystal ball and looked into the future, because this is exactly what has happened. The history of the South was written by the North, which means that Northerners were taught by Northern teachers what the North wished to be the truth about the War of Northern Aggression. That is until the lovely ladies of the United Daughters of the Confederacy stepped in and began to reverse the effects of Reconstruction.
Amen.
These ladies made sure that the Southern history books, that in those books the South was remembered as the heroes that they truly were, and not the vermin that the North attempted to portray them as. However, the UDC could only do but so much. when it comes to teaching the history of the South to those outside of the South, and after 150 years, the history of the South is no longer taught in public schools. The reason for which the South left the Union are no longer talked about, and instead the children's heads are filled with lies of evil Southerners who only wished to keep their slaves. But because of these Confederate monuments that have peppered the courthouse squares and battlefields of Dixieland, we are able to remind our kids that the true cause of the South was freedom, Amen. Not slavery. Southern independence, not Northern tyranny. Amen. The principle of state sovereignty versus federal aggression and power. But don't take my word for it. Listen to the words of the 1907 governor of Virginia, Mr. Claude A. Swanson, when he dedicated the Jefferson Davis Monument on Monument Avenue. Quote, "In this war, the South contended for the sovereignty of states against federal aggression and power. She fought for the great principle of home rule against outside illegal interference. This great doctrine of home rule is the most precious of all rights possessed by mankind. For its maintenance, more armies have been marshaled, more battles fought, more blood sacrificed, more treasure expended than all other causes combined for which man ever contended. Virginia would consider that I had poorly performed the part assigned me if I should fail on this occasion to convey to you her contentious conviction of the justice of our cause and her firm belief that the conduct of herself and her sister states in this conflict needs neither defense nor apology." Amen. That wasn't me speaking, that was the governor of Virginia. Every time we see these monuments, it is an opportunity for us to reflect on the spirit of the Southern soldier. That same spirit that lies deep within every descendant. That same spirit that drove the Southern soldier to march across an open field under heavy artillery fire in Gettysburg. That same spirit that allowed the Southern soldier to survive the starvation, disease, and loneliness of the trenches in Petersburg. Here are two excerpts from a book written in 1882 by a Confederate soldier about what was like to be a Confederate soldier. Quote, "Very few men had comfortable or fitting shoes, and fewer had socks, and as a consequence, the suffering from bruised and inflamed feet was terrible. It was a common practice on long marches for men to take off their shoes and carry them in their hands or swung over their shoulders. Bloody footprints in the snow were not unknown to the soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia." Further along in the book, he says, "To be one day without anything to eat was common. 2 days fasting, marching, and fighting was not uncommon. And there were times when no rations were issued for 3 or 4 days. On one march from Petersburg to Appomattox, no rations were issued to Cutshaw's battalion of artillery for 1 entire week. And the men subsisted on the corn intended for the battery horses, raw bacon captured from the enemy, and the water from springs, creeks, and rivers." End quote. The cause of the South was home rule and home defense, and the spirit of the Southern soldier led the way. These men walked barefoot in the snow. Then they went many days without food. They were outgunned, outmanned, but never outfought. Amen. And they never stopped fighting. That is, until Lee had no other option but surrender. They fought until the very bloody end. Every time we see a Confederate monument, let that be another opportunity to reawaken the spirit of the Southern soldier that dwells deep within you. The spirit of Stuart, the spirit of Lee, the spirit of Jackson. Bravery, honesty, integrity, courage, resilience, and determination. The Southern spirit. These Confederate monuments can help us teach the true history of the South. They can reawaken the spirit of the Confederate soldier. And finally, they can reignite the fires of liberty that burn within our hearts. I like how Thomas Jefferson put it, one of the greatest Southerners of all time. Quote, "When governments fear the people, there is liberty. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny in government." End quote. The southern states tried to secede from the Union peacefully. They tried, and a peaceful departure was denied them. So they exercised their God-given right to bear arms against their oppressor. The fires of liberty burned within these Southerners when they fired the first shots at Fort Sumter, when Jackson held the lines at First Manassas, when Lee ran McClellan away from the gates of Richmond, and when Armistead rallied the troops in Gettysburg by shouting, "Virginians! Virginians! For your land, for your homes, for your sweethearts, for your wives, for Virginia!" The fires of liberty burned within the Southerners of 1861, who were not afraid when the government-funded armies from foreign lands marched onto their soil and into their homes. The fires of liberty burned within these men and women. Rather than roll over and submit to tyranny, they stood up and said, "No more! We will not go quietly into the night. We will stand and fight." So every time you see a Confederate monument, let it remind you that there once was, in the Southland of America, a generation of people, black and white, male and female, young and old, whose internal fire for liberty and freedom allowed them to understand that the people should not be afraid of their government. The government should be afraid of its people. Let it remind you that there once was a generation of people in the Southland of America who said to a tyrannical federal government, "You do not control we the people. It is we the people who control you." Let it remind you that there once was a generation of people in the Southland of America who stood up for truth, honor, dignity, and most importantly, freedom. Without monuments to remind us of these men, the principles for which they fought, the hardships they endured for their cause, and the values and ideals they passed down to us, the United States of America will topple over. Like a tree without its roots, a nation without its history will fall with the next big gust of wind. Our monuments must remain standing. The fate of our country depends on it. Thank you for listening. God bless y'all. God bless the United States of America. And God bless the South.